Putin that is extremely crazy about his plan of capturing whole Ukraine. He cannot provide enough protection and enough defense for his own citizens. Currently, there was I would say, a big group of Russians located just northwest of Suja, and they were in this pocket river on the north, Ukrainian army on the south and east. They were locked in this pocket, and as of this moment, we have information that Ukrainian armed forces managed to secure the gap on the eastern flank, where they could either escape from this trap or receive supplies.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're catching up with one of our regular guests here on Frontline, one of our favourites, Operator Starsky, a Ukrainian veteran YouTuber and co-founder of the Propaganda Study Institute. Operator Starsky, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Hello, James. It's a pleasure to see you again.
It's good to chat because this is the first time we've spoken since Ukraine launched its incursion into the Ksk Oblast of Russia over 3 weeks ago now. What is your assessment of how the incursion is going? And from a Ukrainian perspective, how much has it provided a morale boost for not just Ukrainian troops, but for the people of Ukraine as well?
Well, from my point of view, it provided enormous morale boost, not only for Ukrainian civilians, also for Ukrainian soldiers, but it also showed just how many gaps are there in the Russian defense on the Russian territory. It also, I would say, it's something that proves that karma exists, like for real, and those who bring war to a foreign country, they are doomed to bring it back home. And that's exactly what we see in Kursk. Even though, the people in the Kursk Oblast, and we have plenty of reports from this area, from Ukrainian journalists, from international journalists, everybody can see that Ukrainian army is not Russian army. It's civilized. It provides locals with humanitarian supplies, etc., etc. But the main point is that Putin that is extremely crazy about his plan of capturing whole Ukraine. He cannot provide enough protection and enough defense for his own citizens. Currently, there was I would say, a big group of Russians located just northwest of Suja, and they were in this pocket river on the north, Ukrainian army on the south and east. They were locked in this pocket, and as of this moment, we have information that Ukrainian armed forces managed to secure the gap on the eastern flank, where they could either escape from this trap or receive supplies. So currently, the only way those Russians can escape from this trap prepared by the Ukrainian armed forces is, of course, using pontoons across the river. But we have effective control over this river using our artillery and our drones. Just as I mentioned like a week ago, we can control those areas. We can destroy the pontoons with our artillery and strike drones. So currently, it's estimated that approximately 1,000 Russian troops are still locked there. According to different sources, there's between 700 and 3,000 people. But according to my estimates, there's about 1,000 Russian regular troops, including conscripts. Also, we saw that it was, a big proof of just how efficient, how effective Ukrainian OPSEC is, because nobody knew much about this operation before it started, even though we have information that Russians had clues about possible incursion approximately 2 weeks before it happened, but Putin didn't do anything to prevent it. So even though they had information, they didn't react. They just ignored it. So we will be keeping our eye on this location because it's really important, especially considering the peace summit that will take place in Switzerland soon. I think this location will still play its role in those negotiations. So we will keep watching it.
Has it surprised you, the slowness of the Russian response? The fact that Ukraine has been able to invade Russian territory and occupy it for over 3 weeks now, and Russia, okay, they have launched some counteroffensive operations, but really, Ukraine has been able to consolidate a lot of that territory. Has it taken even you by surprise?
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing was that in the beginning, they tried to close this gap in the front line already on their own territory using not professional Russian troops. And I'm talking, for example, about the hybrid Russian unit, let's call it this way. It's a terrorist group called Petnashka that was brought from the Donetsk territory. And those are not Russian regular troops. Okay, so I remember Petnashka personally since 2015 when we had a deployment to Marinka, where this Russian hybrid unit, together with several other units, attempted to take control over this town, and they were literally obliterated by our artillery. Then my unit, I served in the police back then. My unit and other police units, they provided the filtration of the area, the clearing, let's call it this way. And they were not comparable even to like Russian air assault troops and units like that. So in the beginning, they were brought to deal with Ukrainian armed forces in the area. They failed. They were destroyed by several HIMARS strikes. They lost plenty of vehicles and men. I believe something like battalion, according to Russian sources. And only after that, they brought a regiment from Kharkiv direction. And currently, we know that Russians are mostly relocating troops from Kharkiv area, Kupiansk direction, several units from Zaporizhia direction, but they don't touch the units that are involved in the combat in the direction of Pokrovsk.
You said something really interesting earlier on, Operator Starsky, about the importance of showing the people of Kursk the difference between the Ukrainian forces and how the Russian forces have been acting in Ukraine. There was a really interesting piece by the Times' World Affairs editor, Catherine Philp, a couple of days ago. She's been in Sudzha, which of course is now occupied by the Ukrainians in Kursk, and she'd been speaking to some of the Ukrainian troops who had literally been sitting down the Russian locals, ordinary Russians, and showing them TV footage of the atrocities in Bucha, for example, explaining to them what has been happening in Ukraine and the atrocities that Russia have been committing. And of course, for many ordinary Russians, because of Putin's propaganda, they're not aware of that. So how important, obviously, from a military point of view, it's really important what they're doing in Kursk, but from a kind of hearts and minds perspective, how important is it as well?
It is really important, even considering the fact that a lot of people who live in that area close to Ukraine, a lot of them have Ukrainian roots. Because, as we know, in the beginning of the 20th century, Kursk region belonged to Ukraine. So there's a lot of Ukrainians, like ethnically, a lot of people who still know Ukrainian language and have plenty of relatives on the Ukrainian territory. It was extremely important. And also, we should remember the fact that a lot of people in Sudzha, they were basically abandoned by local Russian authorities. A lot of them were not even warned about the evacuation. They were not notified about it, and a lot of people who were hiding in the basement. You can see probably on plenty of footage. There's people receiving humanitarian aid from the Ukrainian army, and also there's on the background there's like sign saying that in this basement there are just children and civilians. That's exactly what Ukrainians, for example, did in the times of the occupation of Bucha, Irpin. We also had such signs. And we all saw what happened in Bucha. In those basements, there were people found literally with their hands tied and shot. Nothing that we can see in Suja. Of course, it's a completely different story. And people that were abandoned by local authorities, by their own government, they have big opportunity to see how reality looks like. That Ukrainians are not Western race terrorists that wanted to invade Russia and things like that. They can see that Ukrainians are peaceful people who want to end this war, and you can always rely on them. You can receive humanitarian aid from them, medical aid, which is very important. Because Ukrainian army also provides medical aid to those citizens. Hospitals don't work; they don't know where to get medicines and things like that. That's why it was really important from humanitarian standpoint as well.
Is it your view that Ukraine will try and hold on to the territory it's captured for as long as possible? Because I know some analysts said maybe you'd launch this incursion, show that you can do it, and then stage a tactical withdrawal to try and preserve as many men as possible after a few months, say. The other argument would be you hold on to it for as long as possible because it gives you leverage for future peace talks. What side of that debate do you come down on?
Well, it is really hard to say because personally, I don't have any information coming from the general staff as well as other people around the world. So we can only talk about facts. And one specific fact that we know was that Ukrainian armed forces also brought bulldozers, big vehicles to create fortifications and build trenches. So what we know now is that Ukrainian armed forces are building positions in the area that they control currently in Kursk Oblast. So apparently they will be keeping this territory. They will build their positions and they will be keeping it at least for a while. So as for as long as it's needed by the general staff.
And do you think we may see further cross-border raids into Russia? I mean, there has been some activity in recent weeks in Belgorod. Do you think we might see more of that?
Belgorod, Bryansk, we saw several probably attempts of attack. There may be some reconnaissance action taking place because Russian monitoring channels reported that Ukrainian troops were spotted in that area, sometimes involving tanks, heavy armored vehicles. So it is possible that we will also see some scenario like it happened in Suja, for example, in the neighboring territories in Bryansk Oblast and possibly Belgorod Oblast as well.
I wanted to ask you about Russia's manpower problem because it seems to me like Putin is in a really difficult situation whereby he's got a huge casualty rate on the front line in Ukraine. He's got conscripts now fighting on the front line in Ksk, and a lot of those are quite poorly trained. He's got an issue whereby he doesn't want to stage further mobilization because of the political problems that might cause him at home, and he doesn't want to divert troops to Kursk from the front line in Ukraine. So we're hearing about the Russian authorities now setting up new volunteer defense task forces. And having spent months, if not years, talking about the high Russian casualty rate, but basically Russia have been able to get away with it until now because Putin is happy to send people into the meat grinder. Are we now at the point where the Russian casualty rate is really starting to cause an issue for Vladimir Putin? Is this the point where he can't get away with it any longer?
I would say, unfortunately, it's not enough. Not only for Putin, but also for the civilians, for the people populating the terrorist federation. Unfortunately, it's not enough. And my personal prediction for after this incursion happened is that Putin will probably not use this big number of conscripts that he currently has in his possession across the Russian Federation. There's approximately 200,000 Russian conscripts that he can use at any time. A lot of predictions were made by different people, different opinion makers, that he will most probably use those conscripts in order to fight the Ukrainian armed forces in the area. But to me personally, it doesn't seem so, because using conscripts always results in Russian mothers protesting and things like that. That is something that he doesn't want to show to public. Something that he wants to keep secret from his general population. That's why I think that he may still sacrifice some territory in Kursk, maybe in Belgorod, but he will be using more and more mobilized people, his regular troops, in order to fight it, because Russians don't care about two things. It's human life and it's time. They don't really care about those things. It will, of course, slow down their offensive operations, for example, in Zaporizhia and Kharkiv, but they don't care much about time. They will keep pushing, no matter the casualties, and no matter maybe 2 years, 3 years additionally that they will spend on this invasion of Ukraine. They don't care much about it.
It's obviously been a very encouraging few weeks for Ukraine since the incursion into Kursk, but it is worth noting Russia continues to make some incremental gains around Pokrovsk. How concerned are you about that?
We are pretty much concerned about it, but we saw the same situation in Pokrovsk last month. There's a lot of people criticizing the incursion of Kursk because they believe that it led to losing the territory in the Pokrovsk direction. But, for example, Ocheretina, the situation there was also hard even before the incursion of Kursk happened, and it didn't change much since that moment. A lot of military, even in that area, in the Pokrovsk direction that I talked with, they say that even despite the fact that they still have to slowly retreat back, inflicting casualties to the Russian personnel, but the operation in Kursk is still really, really important. And the route for those guys currently on the Russian territory, the Ukrainian soldiers.
It's really interesting when people debate what the primary objective of the Kursk incursion was. And, some people say it's about diverting Russian troops. Other people say it's about taking the war physically to Putin. I increasingly wonder whether it was also designed to send a message to Ukraine's Western allies of, look, we can physically cross a red line. We can physically invade Russia. And the worst case scenario that the West is worried about, of Putin, for example, using tactical nuclear weapons, will not come to pass. And we don't want to be complacent about that, but it certainly hasn't come to pass so far. Do you agree with that? Do you think in part it was designed to send that message to the West?
It was one of the goals. One of the goals was to show Western society that we are not afraid of Russian invaders, and we will be fighting them on their territory, because in the end, Adolf Hitler, for example, was not captured like in Ukraine or in Russia. He was captured in Berlin, right? That's why we have to go there. But hypothetically. But another important goal of this incursion was that Russians are using their territory. Russians using their missile complexes, mobile and stationary missile complexes, in order to launch their missiles at Ukrainian cities. They launched their attack drones from Kursk Oblast, from Belgorod, and unfortunately, our allies protect, those agreements with other Western allies at times protect Ukrainian airplanes and Russian airplanes and Russian missiles more than they protect Ukrainian sky. Unfortunately, that's a fact. That's why it was an attempt to say that, okay, we cannot use long range weapons to strike those targets. We will just go and make sure that they stop killing Ukrainian civilians, and that's what we're doing right now. Of course, from the Kursk territory, it's much easier to strike those targets located there in just 70 kilometers away from our armed forces, and that's exactly what we can see. Even until today, Russians still keep launching their strike drones from Kursk Oblast, but we saw it happening like this week during those drone strikes on Ukraine. They were still launching them from Kursk. So if we are not allowed to use our weapons to strike them from Ukrainian territory from safe distance, then we have no other choice but to go there ourselves.
I mean, we will see whether the US and other Western allies of Ukraine loosen some of those restrictions in the weeks and months to come. Certainly, President Zelensky and many Ukrainians will be hoping so. I just wonder whether Zelensky and General Syrskyi might be considering using some of those weapons anyway, even without their permission, in the same way that the Ksk incursion, as far as we know, did not have any prior approval by the White House, for instance, and it's better almost to seek forgiveness than ask permission. And I wonder whether Ukraine might now feel emboldened to use, for example, the Storm Shadow missiles or long-range ATACMS to hit some of those military targets inside Russia without the West's permission. And once that red line has been crossed, and you'd hope there isn't some massive escalation by Russia, well, maybe the West will just fundamentally change its position. Do you think that may happen?
Well, situation is not that critical yet, to use all we can without permission. But of course, Ukrainian president and Ukrainian general staff, they keep their word. Because unlike Russians, for example, we respect agreements. And there is another situation that not a lot of people talk about, is that situation with the military aid to Ukraine is critical at this point, because a lot of things that were promised to Ukraine in 2023 or 2022, they are not yet delivered. For example, the Patriot batteries, the Patriot systems that were promised by the United States like years ago, I believe, they were not delivered yet. It takes a lot of time for reasons nobody can explain to deliver that absolutely necessary military aid. Some of it is promised to be delivered to Ukraine in like 2027, even though we needed it yesterday, literally. And it's very easy to lose even that tiny support that we have. People that believe that Ukraine is like massively brought all kinds of weapons, American taxes parachuted over people and things like that, tanks, Abramses, hundreds of armored vehicles, they are deluded. They don't understand that Ukraine was only brought a fraction of the aid that was promised. And this is, again, something we should talk about, because Ukrainians need this aid yesterday. And we really hope that our allies will finally understand that if they don't help Ukraine right now with everything our army requires to protect our citizens, they will need to think about ways to somehow protect themselves against Russian aggressor in the future.
That's a really good point you raised, because you're right, there's been so much talk in recent weeks, understandably, about the incursion, and also before that about the delivery of the F-16s. But, it's some of the basics. It is like the Patriot missile systems. It is the air defenses that you really, really need at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to talk about it as much as possible, I believe, in the media, in the social media, because even though we are big friends, we became big friends with our Western allies, etc., but we still need to remind them from time to time what is reality, right? So it's really, really important to remember.
Are you more optimistic now about the weakness of Vladimir Putin's personal position? You have now got certain people, Russian military bloggers criticizing him. You've obviously got some of the locals in Kursk and Belgorod who are expressing frustration about the Russian response. Reports some of the oligarchs around him are agitating as well. Are you feeling more optimistic that he might be in a weaker position than previously thought?
Well, of course, situations like this, they bring some satisfaction to me as a Ukrainian and former Ukrainian military, because when there's new problems emerging for Russia's command, like those bloggers criticizing Putin and things like that, of course, it requires them to stretch their resources and to dedicate some of their efforts to deal with other problems. And that's exactly what we need. I believe the more problems they have there in Russia in terms of military, in terms of informational warfare, I believe the more the better.
Operator Starsky, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.